Hello, marry me. So, I want to review a book. And the book I want to review is not an occult book this time, but a fiction book, a horror anthology. It is The Best Vampire Stories 1800 to 1849, a classic vampire anthology. And it's put together by Andrew Barger. So, basically, this has a lot of early 1800s. That's how we say it, isn't it? Yeah, it's because it would be then the 19th century, but it's the 1800s. I always get those confused. Anyway, it's early 1800s, so it's pre Victorian age vampire stories. And I found them to be really fun. And I also think that it's important for a lot of people who are interested in the Gothic lifestyle to read stories like this. It's so much focus, and it annoys me so much. This idea that no, if you aren't completely gaga about um, Gothic music, especially Gothic music from the 80s, then you aren't goth. And yes, the current Gothic lifestyle grew up from a music scene, but it has so many other uh, things that has inspired it, especially Gothic literature like this. And I think that the Gothic literature should be put as much emphasis on as the music, because not all of us come to Goth because we are in love with that particular genre of music. A lot of us come to it because we like Gothic literature, both classic and modern, and generally are interested in the themes and aesthetic of it. And that should be just as valid. But I am digressing. Let's have a look at what this book contains. So, what do we have? This was what the one that has put it together have made before. That wasn't as interesting as the contents. Here we go. We have an introduction with Andrew Barger with Thief. It just basically discusses a bit about the early vampire fiction and what he considers to be a vampire story and why he has included a lot of those that are very often in such anthologies, but where it is somewhat more ambiguous, whether or not this is a vampire story. And it's an interesting little foreword. Then we get to the stories. We have The Vampire by John Polidori. This is a historically very important piece because it is the first vampire story that was published by an English-speaking author. There were earlier vampire stories, but they were written in French and German. And of course, you have this whole history behind it, where John Polidori and Lord Byron and Mary Shelley and her husband, quite a few others. No, actually, it wasn't quite a few others. It was one more person. It was, I have completely forgotten her name. But anyway, it was a party of people that started telling ghost stories, and there was this dare to write a supernatural story, which, and at that point, Mary Shelley started writing Frankenstein, and Lord Byron started the outskirts of a vampire story, but John Polidori finished it, and that is The Vampire. And it's a very interesting story, but I don't think it's very well written. I think that it's very oddly paced, and while the base idea of it is really, really good, and that base idea was Lord Byron's, the way it is executed is, but it's still very important to read it because it's such an important piece of vampire story history. If you like this genre, you should read The Vampire. Basically, what it's about is this young nobleman who meets this suave guy that just do every vice you can think of, and they decide to travel together through Europe. Of course, eventually it is shown that the illustrious Lord Raven, it's the only reason why I know it is actually pronounced Raven is because I have seen a lot of documentaries about this, because nobody would guess that from how it is spelled. Absolutely no one. Let me see if I can find the spelling here. It's boom boom boom. It says that name a million times in there, so it should be that difficult to find. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, yes, yes. I can't seem to find the spelling here, but anyway, nobody would guess that. But anyway, Lord Raven and this Aubrey, young Lord Aubrey, goes around, and it seems that Lord Raven might not be as well a guy as they first thought. And of course, then, and I'm not going to spoil the other stories, but this one is pretty well known. It's basically Lord Raven is killed in a bandit attack, and before his death, he makes Aubrey swear that he will never tell anybody that he has died or anything that's happened during their journey for 1 year. And of course, Lord Raven comes back and he woos Aubrey's sister, and it's quite tragic. I like the idea of being under a binding oath so that you know that this is going to shit, but you can't say anything. That's a very interesting concept. So the concept of the story is very interesting, but it isn't very well written. But it's well worth checking out anyway. Then you have Wake Not the Dead, and it is actually pretty good. It's a German story about a nobleman who loses his beloved wife, and then one day he meets a wizard who is walking around and collecting various plants of the cemetery. And of course, seeing it's a wizard, he immediately goes over and says, hello, can you wake my dead wife back to life, please? And we can imagine what happens next. It's a pretty good story. It's very bleak, but it's pretty good. And we have The Vampire of the Carpathian Mountains. Let me just say the authors. Of course, The Vampire is Jan Polidori. Wake Not the Dead is Ernest Ropath. And The Vampire of the Carpathian Mountains is written by Alexander Dumas. And this story is very well written. And you can see that basically Dumas has a flair for adventure and romance, and it's very much a part of it. It's a very good story. It's about a young Polish noblewoman who has to flee when her father, a general, gets taken down by the Russians. She has to flee, and after an attack by bandits, she ends up in a faraway castle with an old Slavic princess and her 2 sons. The 2 sons, of course, both want this young woman. So you have a bit of a love drama there, and then vampires get involved. So that's one of my favorites in this collection. Then you have The Strange Event in the Life of Stachan the Painter. And it wasn't my favorite story. It is pretty well written. It's basically about this young painter who is in love with his teacher's lovely daughter. No, niece, she's his teacher's lovely niece. But then one day this strange man with blue skin and fangs comes and offers a tremendous amount of money to marry said niece, which of course the teacher agrees to because it's all about the money, and the tragedy assumes. Then we have, and it was written by Joseph Sheridan Lafeu. I think that's how it's supposed to be pronounced. I don't know. I am not good at pronunciating things. Anyway, then we have and it was my ability to pronunciate things. Pepo Pukin in Croatia by Arthur Young. This is it's not really a vampire story. I don't really know why it's in here, and the introduction to it sort of makes me think that the one that put it, that basically our Mr. Barger here, didn't read the story because it's not really a vampire story. It's a comedy about this really silly, grandiose chevalier who wants to marry the pretty young daughter of a nobleman. She, however, loves another person, and she, her sisters, and her servants decide to scare her unwanted suitor away by making him think he's being hunted by a vampire. Piece is pretty funny. It's definitely a comic relief with these other rather heavy stories. So it's a good story, but it isn't really a vampire story. But I guess since vampires are a theme, you could sort of fit it in there anyway. Then you have The Black Vampire, A Legend of Saint Domingo by Robert C. Sands. Or that's who we think has written it. It was written under a pseudonym, and we are not completely sure who wrote it, but that's the assumed author. Anyway, this is also a comedy, but there's definitely vampires involved. And I think this might be one of the stories that's hardest to read for modern readers, simply because it's about slavery in the 1800s in the United States. And while basically introduction says it's sort of against slavery, yeah, the vampire is against slavery. He holds a speech against it. But how the story goes doesn't really support that because, yeah, it also uses quite a few words that might be a bit rude to say to an African American or any other person of African descent. So, with modern eyes, this might be a story that's hard to read. Just putting that out there, that might trigger someone. But what it's about is this French plantation owner who buys a young 10-year-old boy and murders him just for the hell of it. However, this boy becomes a vampire and kills his assailant, and then later returns as an African prince and seduces his former wife. And yeah, I didn't really like the story. It's sort of choppy and strange. It's meant to be a comedy, but it isn't that funny. But since it is the third English vampire story and one of the very first published by an American author, it's worth checking out. And then we have my favorite of the bunch, Clarimonde, by Théophile Gontier. It is a really, really nice story about a young priest who falls in love with a courtesan. This courtesan, of course, immediately turns out to be a vampire. And I'm not spoiling anything by that because it's pretty clear from the start that she's a vampire. And yeah, it's a really good romantic tale with a tragic romance, and there's all chilled castles and pretty women with blood on their lips. It's a perfect Gothic story. In addition, it has this strange astral projection type undertones to it, which is really interesting. So, yes. Is this a good book? Absolutely. However, these stories, of course, are public domain. You can probably, some of them aren't been, according to what this book says, hasn't been published again since their first publication. It's a possibility you can find them elsewhere. But this isn't a very expensive book. I think I paid $10 for it. I think it says here. Yeah, it's $11. $11 is what I paid for it. And there's some really, really good Gothic stories in here. So yeah, I recommend it. The forewords to each story gives a bit of context, but can be a bit long-winded. But yeah, I really have no complaints. For $11, this is a lot of good entertainment. And that is my review of the best vampire stories, 1800 to 1849, classic vampire anthology. I see that the author, or rather the one that put this together, has published several other anthologies with old horror stories, one with werewolves and some with ghosts, and yeah, and one with general horror stories. So I think I will have to pick some of those up as well. So yeah, I hope you have a great day, blessed be, and Happy New Year's.